Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. We join you at the end of the summer holidays as Holyrood returns to business, and it promises to be an interesting and action-packed week at the Scottish Parliament. On Tuesday, we expect to hear a statement from Shona Robertson, the Finance Secretary, detailing the government's response to its spending pressures. And on Wednesday, we hear the latest programme for government, John Swinney's first full legislative agenda as First Minister of Scotland and leader of the SNP. We're also recording this, obviously, in the aftermath of the SNP's conference, which was held last weekend in Edinburgh. Now, Bernard, you were not present at the conference because you were at Celtic Park on Sunday, and from that I deduced that you had a significantly happier weekend than almost anybody at the conference in Edinburgh. Is that not the case?
Well, I am told that John Swinney's speech was 38 minutes in total, that the hall wasn't exactly packed, unlike Celtic Park, which was indeed packed yesterday. I think that, I did look in on all of the reports of the conference and watched all of the television reports on it. So you do get a sense of it, although it's a different sense from actually being there and talking to activists. What's to be made of it? Well, on this podcast before, I've said that the SNP in the aftermath of the general election needed to do two things. The first thing they needed to do was to crystallise what they were going to do on the independence question. And the second thing that they had to do was to start getting together some sort of policy prospectus in the run-up to 2026 to give a distinct offer to Scottish voters. Otherwise, they were going to be on the slide. Now, we can take all of these questions in turn, Alex, and chew the fat on them. But I thought what was very instructive was the reports that were made of the private session when they were looking at the aftermath of the election result and what went wrong. And what was very interesting from that is that there was an acceptance that about 250,000 voters, according to the party, transferred from the SNP to Labour. And clearly some within the party think that's because they were exercising too much about independence and not enough about policy issues. And the second thing was that clearly an internal debate about, does the SNP pitch itself towards aspirational Scotland? And in that context, are tax rates here too high, given that you're paying more tax if you earn over £28,000? These are quite fundamental questions, and I would suggest that they're quite fundamental for the SNP. I mean, it was only the last First Minister, Humza Yousaf, who was flirting with the STUC's tax and spend policies, which would have reduced the higher rate from 43,500 to 40,000. It is perfectly clear that that drift and that perhaps instinct towards higher taxes is very much at an end. What we didn't really learn was anything in terms of new policy, principally because, as you said in the introduction, Alex, we're going to get tomorrow the details of where the axe is going to fall. And if you're cutting, you can hardly be announcing new policy.
Absolutely. I mean, John Swinney's speech was unusual as a party leader's speech at a conference because it didn't contain even a single new policy. There were no rabbits. The SNP is all out of rabbits as we approach the start of the new parliamentary session. And you're right too, I think, Bernard, to stress the most interesting part of the conference was the private session held on Friday morning. I say private because the media were not permitted access to it, but helpfully somebody who was in attendance leaked a recording of the session to my colleague Kieran Andrews at the Times, and so there was this opened, if you like, a window onto the SNP's internal discussions. And what you had there was a presentation delivered by Marco Biaggi, a former junior minister who'd been charged with researching the party's attitudes to the general election campaign, a catastrophic result for the SNP, in which, let us recall, they lost 39 of the 48 MPs they had won at the previous general election in 2019. So, this is a taking stock, a soul-searching moment for the nationalists. And it was quite clear when you read the account in the Times of what was being said in that session that voters transferred from SNP to Labour, not just because they thought it was time for a change of government at Westminster, not just because they wanted to vote Labour to get rid of the Tories, but also because they wanted to vote Labour to send a message to the SNP, a message of considerable unhappiness with the state of public services in Scotland, a message of unhappiness when it came to, at least amongst wealthier voters, the higher rates of income tax levied on them in Scotland, and a general sense, as Biaggi put it, that voters think the SNP is, quote, a mess, unquote. Now, that's partly, I think, a response to the shenanigans surrounding the collapse of the Butte House Agreement between the SNP and the Greens, partly a reflection of the shadow cast by Operation Branchform, the police investigation into the SNP's finances, and the arrest and charging on counts of embezzlement of Peter Murrell, the former chief executive and notably husband of Nicola Sturgeon. All of these things combined, plus I think the fact that the SNP has now been in power for nearly 2 decades, and you create a situation, almost a kind of perfect storm, in which the governing party is really on the back foot. And you know, this wasn't, there was no sense, I think, from this presentation to SNP members that that voters were going to be returning to the SNP anytime soon, that this was just a protest vote in which voters were lending support to the Labour Party, and could be counted on to return to the SNP fold at the Holyrood election in 2026. No, this was something much more serious for the SNP, a sense of profound alienation amongst a large part of the electorate, especially amongst middle-class voters.
Let's look at two issues here and we'll deal with them separately. Let's first of all start with the independence question, and then let's look at the First Minister's speech in terms of what it might tell us about how the SNP are going to play the next couple of years in the run-up to the Holyrood election. Let's start with the independence question. I always think if you're going to have a strategy, it has to be crystal clear, unambiguous. People understand it. And certainly from reading all of the reports, it would appear that there is an element of mixed messaging. There appears to be an acceptance, if you could call this the Stuart MacDonald line, and we had Stuart on this podcast just after the general election, was that it doesn't matter that support for independence is still high in the polls, if it's not what people regard as the priority now or the priority for 2026, why keep talking about it and why put it on a page where the Scottish electorate or a lot of the Scottish electorate are not on that page? That will simply wind them up and will grease your slide from power. That's very much his argument. And the sense that you get was that there was no new strategy. There was no new strategy unveiled at the conference, and yet the First Minister saying what we have to do is that in the future we have to marry all the difficulties we have in policy and explain to people what difference independence would make. So what it appeared to me that they're doing is that they're still going to talk up independence and the case for independence, but they're not going to deal with what is the far trickier question, which is to debate and agree on a strategy and how you actually get there. Insofar as that there was anything which was interesting of a strategic note, it was this idea that the pro-independence parties in Scotland should come together in some sort of convention. Now, the problem with that is simply this. The sense that I get is that, of course, the First Minister has to be seen to be talking about independence. It's in his party's DNA, but they're not going to pursue a de facto referendum or a clear strategy to break the log jam or to try and force Westminster's hand. That's now done. But if you go into a convention with other pro-independence parties, many of whom are extremely angry with the SNP for what they see as inaction on the issue of the strategy towards independence, well, that convention could actually end up falling apart. So on the one hand, no strategy on independence, but we'll continue to talk about it, and we'll continue to talk about it with other pro-independence parties who fundamentally take, I think, a different view from the SNP in these matters.
Absolutely, and I think there is a very clear sense of strategic confusion, even of contradiction at the heart of what John Swinney was saying at the conference last weekend. Because on the one hand, you have the SNP saying, "Well, we have talked too much about the process of independence." But how we would force or deliver a second referendum at a time when there is palpably no great enthusiasm amongst the electorate as a whole for such an enterprise. And then you have them saying, so henceforth, we are not going to talk about the process. We're going to talk about the substance of independence, but we're not going to talk about currency. We're not going to talk about trade and the border. We're not going to talk about the EU because these are all questions that are unanswered. And the SNP has had 8, sometimes even 10 years in which to come up with at least different or more plausible answers than they had in 2014 on some of these questions, and singularly failed to do so, I would suggest. But we're going to talk about how independence is the key to fixing the NHS. It's the key to fixing other problems in public sector life. It's the key to a more dynamic and prosperous economy, and so on and so on. Which seems to me to at least run the risk of misjudging the fallout from and the meaning of the general election result. Because when you go into an election having won 48 MPs at the last general election, and you come out of it with 9, and you have had independence as they constantly said, page 1, line 1 of the SNP manifesto, and you suffer this kind of calamitous defeat, it strikes me that the obvious thing to learn from that is that the public is not on the same page. It's certainly not on page 1, line 1, as the SNP when it comes to the national question. And while obviously one accepts that it is almost impossible for the SNP to give up on independence or even to park it in a lay-by for a little while, nevertheless, that is essentially the meaning of the general election result, or at least seems to me to be the clearest and most obvious meaning of it. And for all that SNP politicians say, well, look, we still have 45, 48% of the public saying they support independence. So the key thing is we need to get people who support independence back into the SNP tent. Well, yes, but how strong is that support? I mean, it strikes me that this is a hypothetical endorsement of a hypothetical independence, that in the fullness of time, all things being equal, if we could satisfy X, Y, and Z, then yes, I support independence right now. But I don't think voters say that it's an immediate priority. And so go away, think about it, and come back to us when you have some better answers. But that is not really, I think, what the SNP wishes to hear. And one can understand, again, why that's the case. And on this, I think you're also right to bring up this question that was raised by Pete Wishart most prominently, that there should be a sort of pro-independence convention, another talking shop, because the SNP loves having special conferences and special conventions on the national question. And this would presumably require the involvement of the Green Party and also of Alex Salmond's Alba Party. Now, those parties don't agree on anything except independence, and I don't actually see how you can A, get them in the same room, and B, what you could profitably hope to take out of that room having had such a meeting. But perhaps I'm mistaken on that.
Yeah, I mean, just teasing out a little further the issue of the convention. Why might it be suggested by some people within the SNP? Well, precisely because they took a drubbing at the general election, some within the party will say, look, the SNP does not carry the torch for Scottish independence solely, that we have to accept that there are people out there who support independence but who do not support the SNP. There is a credibility gap in the polls between those who say they support Scottish independence and those who say they will vote for us, the SNP. Now, in order to try and maximise a degree of unity in this, pro-independence parties should come together. So I see on the one level the attraction of that, but it's an attraction which, in my view, is really superficial, because realpolitik, I think, would render that problematic for this reason. Let's assume that the Greens and the SNP and ALAPA all get into one room or one convention. And remember, ALAPA were arguing for a convention some time ago. It's not exactly a new idea. The first thing that Alex Salmond will place on the agenda is what is the strategy to get a pro-independence majority in the Parliament in 2026. and they will start campaigning for electoral arrangements. And at that point, it would completely and utterly fall apart, because there's no way that the SNP are going to deal with ALAPA in terms of an independence unity candidate on the list, for example. The SNP are going to insist that they stand in the constituencies and the list. The Greens will probably say the first thing a convention should do is to link independence to an environmental agenda, and that they should come up with an offer on that kind of issue before the 2026 election. So in that sense, you are right. You can see why it might be a good idea to get people within the one convention. But these parties are attacking sometimes the substance, but more profoundly the strategies on independence from a completely and utterly different way. And it might actually have the effect not of bolstering the credibility of the SNP, but of actually undermining it.
Absolutely. And I think there is there is the risk of misjudging the public mood. We have had a decade, more than a decade, of fairly attritional constitutional warfare in Scottish politics. It has been the dominant question ever since 2011, really. And I think there is now a profound weariness with that. And while, the SNP obviously can't escape independence, they can't force people to be enthused by independence against their will. And that is, it seems to me, where the party is now. It's rather like trying to push water uphill. And again, I think we can reflect on the fact that, there is a shift of emphasis here. I mean, last week we had Alex Neil, former cabinet secretary, on the programme, and he was talking to us about how, if you go all the way back to 2007, and Alex Salmond's first term as First Minister, the key insight from the gradualist wing of the SNP, as it was back then, was that, we demonstrate our fitness for independence by making a success of our devolved responsibilities in government. Now, however, the message seems to be that the problems in the NHS, the problems in education, the problems in the Scottish economy, etc., are so severe that they can't be fixed without independence. So, in other words, the implicit message of this new approach is, we have failed as a devolved government. Trust us with the greater powers and responsibilities of independence, and we will make a success of it. Now, you can just about see a thread of logic there, perhaps, but I'm going to suggest to you, Bernard, that it is not a thread of logic that the electorate is going to embrace.
Well, it gets back to the fundamental issue that there might be many people out there who support in principle the idea of Scottish independence, but they don't think it's the number one issue now. And the danger for the SNP is that they'll speak to an agenda which people don't think is the agenda which should dominate the 2026 election. That Alec Neil, in a sense, was saying that one of the problems that they've had is that the record in that sense has started to go sour. But be in no doubt, the 2026 election is going to be fought predominantly, maybe not exclusively. I mean, voters have the right to decide what issues are important to them. It's not a matter for political parties, or indeed, dare I say it, commentators to say these are the issues. For some people, independence will still be the number one issue in 2026. But the polls are suggesting that even many people who support Scottish independence, they don't think it's the number one issue for that election campaign. And therefore, it will be fought predominantly, in my view, on the record of the SNP in government. And here we sort of, in a sense, lead on to John Swinney's speech. You're sitting there listening to the speech thinking, what's the offer going to be? What is the reset in policy terms going to be? How is he going to remold politics in the next 2 years to get it on an agenda which is more advantageous for the SNP and increases the likelihood that they may well win the election? And the fact is, there wasn't any ideas. Now, Alex Neil in this podcast last week, as I put it, was crackling with ideas. Now, you can debate the merits of whether or not they are right or not, but there were some sort of ideas there, which is an attempt to try and grab hold of the political agenda. And the problem that he has, Mr. Swinney, and we've said this before, is that the 30th of October is a much more profound date for the Scottish Government than anything which is happening tomorrow or Wednesday, because you will have some sort of view on the UK macroeconomic framework and fiscal framework, which in turn will determine whether or not the Scottish Government have any fiscal wriggle room to do anything about the state of public services. And the Prime Minister is already softening the electorate up for a pretty difficult statement from Rachel Reeves on the 30th of October. So the bottom line is that the financials ain't going to change. His political room for manoeuvre is very, very limited. And the chances are that he will have to spend the entire campaign in 2026, not with any new offer, but of defending the past. And some people think on that agenda, the SNP are onto a hiding.
Well, I think it's very difficult for them. I mean, they are obviously right that budget decisions taken by the Treasury, by the Chancellor in London, have an impact and consequences for not just Scotland, but all the devolved nations of the United Kingdom. That is clearly the case. However, it is also obviously the case that the Scottish Government's room for manoeuvre is constrained by the consequences of its own past decisions. I mean, that's not just my view, that's the view of the Scottish Fiscal Commission in a report last week, which, and some of those decisions are quite significant. Inflation above inflation pay settlements to public sector workers, perfectly defensible as individual choices, no doubt. Additional welfare benefits, again, perfectly defensible as an individual choice. The maintenance of long-standing SNP policies, such as, free university tuition, again, perfectly defensible as an individual choice. But put all of these things together and you're suddenly talking about real money. And so it is very difficult for the Scottish Government to make further room for manoeuvre. I mean, I think if you look at what the government is saying, though, not just John Swinney, but also important and influential people like Kate Forbes, it is quite clear, I think, that there are not going to be significant tax increases on income tax in the Scottish budget when it's unveiled towards the end of this year. They have realised that the room for manoeuvre there for piling more, if you like, more weight on those they have the broad shoulders is now extremely limited. And so, instead we have a series of cuts, and some of these have already been presented to the public. So the abandonment of the experiment of cutting peak time fares on the railways. That's a fairly small bore thing, but that's about £40 million that they'll save there. Again, the Sunday Times reported at the weekend that Shona Robertson is looking at an overall package of spending astringency, if you like, or spending austerity. Not that the SNP would accept that that's the term to be applied, but that in total it'll amount to around £600 million, which is a bit less than the cost of free university tuition, to put it into a sort of comparative terms, or about a third of the policing budget. So these are really quite significant savings that are going to have to be made. And it's not clear that the Scottish Government has actually prepared the ground for this. And so you have them sort of trying to suggest that it's not our fault. We are responding to circumstances which are not within our control. Now, there's a degree in which that's tenable, I suspect, but it's not wholly plausible, I think, as a political matter, as a question of political salesmanship, to say, hang on a minute, the people responsible for this are the Labour Party, who've been in power at a UK level for 8 weeks. And it has nothing to do with the SNP, who've been in power in Scotland for 17 years.
Absolutely. And I think that Alec Neil made the point on the podcast last week when I said to him, and I still suspect that the SNP line between now and the election, and indeed during the election, is that all of the ills which have been visited upon us is all Westminster austerity, and Tory austerity has been replaced by Labour austerity. That is what I suspect the line will be. But as I put to Alec, I think the problem with old songs is that people get really rather tired of them. And for the very point that you have made, I think the substantial problem for the SNP is that they will not be believed, not least because the Scottish Fiscal Commission have pointed out that the very difficulties which the Finance Secretary will address in Parliament tomorrow are precisely because of the spending decisions which the Scottish Government have made. Nothing to do with what's happening with the block grant, nothing to do with what's happening in Westminster, but everything to do with the political choices which the government are making. And I've made the point before on the podcast, you can make the case for individual policies. You can actually make the case that it was right, as I actually happen to believe that it was right, and the government should be commended for attempting to help workers who are struggling in a cost of living crisis. But you cannot, in a management sense, plan public expenditure by baking into your budget salaries going up by 3% when you're settling for double that at every single stage and every single settlement for every single sector and every single group of worker. You have to say, we are doing this because it's the right thing to do in a cost of living crisis. But the opportunity cost of spending that kind of money means that it can't be spent elsewhere. And that's why you have, for example, 450 teaching posts in the city of Glasgow, which are not going to be filled. What actually politicians need to do is to have an honest conversation with the public about the real costs of providing public services. But it's because everything is being squeezed that there is no room for manoeuvre for Mr. Swinney. And I suspect that come the next election, it will be dominated by his record in government.
I agree, and I'd make this further observation, Bernard. I think there is a strategic difficulty, or a difficulty of political consistency, if you like, that the SNP now has to face. Because if you remember, Nicola Sturgeon and then Humza Yousaf forged this coalition with the Greens. This was to be a radical and progressive government, but it was one that was undoubtedly placed less emphasis on the economy and the importance of economic growth than other Scottish governments might. Now, if you speak to people in business now around Scotland, they say that they are quite encouraged by at least the change of tone emanating from Bute House, that John Swinney and Kate Forbes in particular want to reset the relationship with corporate Scotland. They believe in in not just the importance, but the necessity of economic growth. Now, that is an abrupt gear change from the coalition with the Green Party. I mean, the Green Party is actually intrinsically hostile to the whole concept of economic growth. It views capitalism as a sort of resource exploitation and so on. And we need to make less, spend less, earn less, do less to save the planet. Now, again, you can hold that line. You can think it's a defensible line, absolutely. But you now have an SNP that has at least implicitly embraced some part of that message as recently as last year. Or indeed earlier this year, and is now sort of pivoting to a pro-growth agenda. So I would suggest that the discrepancy between these two versions of the SNP that we've had within the last 12 months and so on is also the sort of thing that suggests the government doesn't actually know its own path in certain respects. And again, this inconsistency confuses voters and leaves one to wonder what exactly does the SNP believe in beyond itself, its idea of Scotland, and of course, independence. And so if you accept all of that, then you fall back again on what you were referring to there as a sort of culture of managerialism, which is fine in good times, but it isn't the same as real political leadership.
I'm going to leave you with one final thought on all of this. And we have a tale of two governments who, to a certain extent, are riding the same horse, because the Labour government at Westminster are saying it is all the fault of the Tories, and the only way out of this is economic growth. The SNP and Mr. Swinney are on exactly the same horse. The only difference is it's all the fault of Westminster, and the only way out of this is economic growth. In a sense, the analysis of how you help improve public services through economic growth, there's no real difference between Labour and the SNP on this. The problem, though, for the SNP is simply this. I think most people will say in relation to the new government that they understand that it is early days. And, I think the 30th of October will be tough. I think they've got a limited room in terms of where they go. I think it's almost certain that inheritance tax will be fundamentally reshaped. Only about 1 in 10 estates actually fall within the current rules. I suspect that will change. I think there will be fundamental changes to capital gains tax. I think tax relief on pensions, particularly for those at the higher rate, will be aligned more with the rates of income tax. In fact, that was a policy which was championed by Nigel Lawson's many decades ago. So there will be a fundamental rate, and I expect also that Rachel Reeves, because this is what drives the most money, will probably extend the freezes to allowances, which of course they're frozen to 2028. The next election won't come to 2029. I suspect Labour will be forced to extend them by another year. But you have a situation in London where they are trying to plug, however, 22 billion, whatever it is, this black hole in the public finances. But plugging a black hole in the public finances doesn't change public services. It does not deal with a crisis in health and other public services. And therefore, Labour are banking on economic growth between now and the next election to help them get them out of a hole. So there ain't going to be any largesse this year or next year. And the problem for the Scottish Government, it means, is that they have absolutely no room for manoeuvre in terms of trying to change the domestic agenda before 2026. And because of the Fiscal Commission intervention about the choices that the Scottish Government makes, it will help Scottish Labour. It will help Scottish Labour at the election, because it's already clear that John Swinney will be saying, Anas Sarwar, and that BBC debate during the course of the general election said, read my lips, no austerity with Labour. Well, the position will be from the SNP, this is Labour austerity. Labour's position will be, this is all on your watch, and it all predates what Labour have done in government in the UK.
Absolutely. And, Labour, it's one thing for a new government to come in and sort of, reset expectations. It's very difficult for a government that has been in power for as long as the SNP has to do the same. And yet that is what John Swinney is charged with doing. And yet, inescapably, there is nevertheless the sense that, is John Swinney actually the person capable of doing this? I mean, he has already been SNP leader a generation ago. And I think that is a further problem for him. It is very difficult for him to present himself as an agent or driver of change. And the Scottish Government, is hemmed in by its own choices. It also has lots of things that, it must deal with things that aren't of its own creation, absolutely. But nevertheless, voters are entitled, I think, to pass judgment on the Scottish Government's record. And if the Scottish Government continues to say, look, none of this is our responsibility, none of it's our fault. In fact, the system itself is inimical to Scotland's opportunities and prospects. We cannot make it work. Devolution is broken because the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the powers that it requires to address the major issues and challenges that face the country. Well, it seems to me that I would suggest then that creates a very good space for Anas Sarwar and the Scottish Labour Party when it comes to the 2026 election, because they will be able to say to voters in Scotland that, look, by their own admission, the SNP say they cannot make it work. Well, the Labour Party both can and will make it work. So vote for change. And I would say that, ostensibly, at least on the surface and so on, intuitively, a lot of voters may find that a plausible and perhaps even attractive proposition.
Well, as you said right at the introduction, Alex, we've got that statement from the Finance Secretary tomorrow to MSPs, where we will learn where the axe will fall. We'll get the programme for government on Wednesday. No doubt we will be back later in the week to chew over the fallout from these pretty fundamental announcements to MSPs now that they're back at Holyrood. Do get in touch if you want to get anything off your chest. Remember, it's ponsonbaymassey@gmail.com, and on X it's at ponsonbaymassey. But for this edition of the podcast, hope you've enjoyed it. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.